The halls of St. Augustine Medical Center carried the scent of antiseptic and quiet desperation. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, stepped through the sliding doors with her usual unshakable confidence, though inside, she could feel a storm brewing. She had seen corruption before. She had faced criminals, fraudsters, and liars. But this case, this was different. This was personal. The tip had come in 2 days ago, an anonymous source claiming that Dr. Victor Langston, one of the hospital's most respected surgeons, was running a scheme. Patients who should have recovered mysteriously worsened. Families were pressured into expensive, unnecessary procedures. And some, too many, never left the hospital alive. Pam had spent her career cutting through deception like a scalpel, but even she knew that doctors were among the hardest criminals to catch. A corrupt physician wielded something far more powerful than a gun or a knife. He wielded trust. She adjusted the visitor badge on her blazer and headed toward the ICU. Her contact, a nurse named Melissa Carter, was waiting near the reception desk, her face tense with fear. "Miss Bondi," Melissa whispered as Pam approached. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Pam gave her a reassuring smile. "When I hear someone's making innocent people suffer, I don't have a choice." Melissa swallowed hard. "It's worse than you think. I have proof. Medical records, financial documents. But I need to be careful. Langston, he knows things. He has people watching." Pam glanced over her shoulder, scanning the dimly lit hallway. She could feel eyes on her. Hospitals were supposed to be places of healing, yet the atmosphere here felt suffocating, thick with something unspoken. "Let's talk somewhere private," Pam said. Melissa led her to a supply room, locking the door behind them. She pulled out a folder from her bag and handed it over. Pam flipped through the pages, her lawyer's mind instantly picking up on the patterns. Patients admitted with mild conditions, subjected to unnecessary surgeries, their insurance billed for exorbitant amounts. And then, the deaths. These patients. "They all died after similar complications," Pam murmured. Melissa nodded. "They never should have died. Dr. Langston always had an explanation. Undetected clot, sudden infection. But it's happening too often. And the worst part." She hesitated, voice shaking. "Some of them had money. A lot of money. And I think he's making sure he benefits from it." Pam's stomach clenched. Medical murder and financial fraud. Langston wasn't just playing God. He was profiting off the dead. A sudden knock on the door made Melissa jump. "Who is it?" Pam called, her voice steady. No answer. Melissa's eyes went wide with fear. Pam closed the folder and stuffed it into her purse before unlocking the door. A tall man in scrubs stood there, his expression blank. "Dr. Langston wants to see you," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Pam studied him. "And who are you?" "Derek," he said. No last name. No explanation. Pam gave him a polite smile. "I'll be there shortly." Derek hesitated, as if debating whether to insist. Then, with a small nod, he walked off. Melissa grabbed Pam's wrist. "You shouldn't go." Pam covered Melissa's hand with her own. "If I don't, he'll know we're onto him." Taking a deep breath, Pam left the supply room and made her way down the hallway toward Langston's office. The air felt colder here, the hum of medical machines somehow more ominous. The door was already open. Dr. Victor Langston sat behind his desk, his white coat pristine, his silver hair neatly combed back. He was the picture of authority, of success. But Pam saw through the mask. "Miss Bondi," Langston said, smiling like a snake. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Pam stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. She leveled her gaze at him, unflinching. "I'm here because I don't believe in coincidences, Dr. Langston." Langston leaned back, folding his hands together. "Neither do I." For a moment, the room was silent, a quiet war of wills taking place in the space between them. Pam broke the silence first. "There are too many deaths in this hospital. Too many families who never get answers. And the money," she let the words linger, "let's just say it raises some serious questions." Langston chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Ms. Bondi, you wound me. Do you really think I'd risk my entire career, my entire legacy, on something so pedestrian?" Pam took a step closer, her pulse steady. "I think you're a man who's gotten away with too much for too long. And I think you're starting to get nervous." Langston's eyes darkened. "Be careful, Miss Bondi," he murmured. "This is a hospital. Accidents happen all the time." Pam's lips curled into a slow smile. "Then I suppose it's a good thing I never believe in accidents." Langston held her gaze for a beat longer before he finally stood. "I have a surgery to prepare for. I trust you'll see yourself out." Pam turned to leave, but before stepping out, she glanced back. "Oh, and Dr. Langston?" He arched an eyebrow. "Don't get too comfortable. I'll be seeing you again soon." As she walked away, she could feel Langston's eyes burning into her back. The game had begun, and she was going to make damn sure he lost. Dr. Leonard Bishop sat across from Pam Bondi in the interrogation room at the Federal Building. The fluorescent light overhead cast harsh shadows on his face, deepening the creases on his forehead. His white coat was gone, replaced by a plain gray button-down and slacks, clothes that made him look more like a desperate man than a respected surgeon. Pam had dealt with men like him before. Men who thought they could talk their way out of anything. She flipped open the file on the table. "Dr. Bishop, we have clear evidence that you've been ordering medical supplies under false pretenses, diverting them to illegal clinics, and covering it up with falsified hospital records." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Bishop exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." Pam wasn't fazed. She slid a document toward him. "Here's a shipment invoice from last month, 40 units of anesthesia, signed off under your name." She pulled out another. "Here's a transport log showing those same supplies never made it to hospital storage." Then, another. "And here's a security report showing a hospital van arriving at an off-site warehouse, a warehouse that's already under federal investigation." Bishop stared at the papers, saying nothing. Pam leaned forward, voice steady. "The only question now is whether you want to cooperate or let this case bury you." Bishop let out a humorless chuckle. "I want my lawyer." Pam sat back, unfazed. She had expected this. The door opened, and Detective Ryan Wilkes stepped in. A seasoned investigator, Wilkes had built a reputation on making criminals sweat. He placed a manila folder on the table, took a seat beside Pam, and flipped it open. "Dr. Bishop," Wilkes said casually, "we pulled bank records this morning. Interesting stuff. Large cash deposits showing up in your account every few weeks, amounts that just happen to match the market price for stolen medical supplies." Bishop's fingers curled slightly. Wilkes continued. "Now, we ran a background check on your known associates. One name stood out. Daniel Vega. You know him." Bishop's throat bobbed. "Never heard of him." Wilkes smirked. "That's funny, because Vega's phone records show multiple calls between the two of you. We also have security footage of him picking up a shipment from your hospital's loading dock." He tilted his head. "Still want to say you've never heard of him?" Pam watched as Bishop's composure began to crack. A bead of sweat formed near his temple. His mouth pressed into a thin line. Wilkes leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. "Vega's already talking. Document." Bishop flinched. Pam seized the moment. "He's giving up everything. Names, locations, money trails. The longer you sit here in silence, the worse it gets for you." Bishop swallowed hard. But he still didn't talk. Pam exchanged a glance with Wilkes before standing. "All right. We'll let you sit with your thoughts for a while." As she walked toward the door, Bishop suddenly spoke. "This isn't what you think it is." Pam turned, arching a brow. "Then explain it to me." Bishop hesitated, his fingers twitching. "I'm not saying anything without my lawyer." Pam sighed, shaking her head. He was close, but not close enough. Wilkes signaled to the officer outside. "Take him back to holding." As the officers led Bishop away, Pam exhaled slowly. She had been hoping to break him here and now. But it didn't matter, because his next stop was the courthouse. And that was where the real pressure would begin. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras flashing as Dr. Leonard Bishop was led inside, his wrists free of handcuffs but his face pale. His high-priced defense attorney, Robert Kessler, walked beside him, whispering in his ear. At the prosecution's table, Pam Bondi sat with Detective Ryan Wilkes, reviewing their strategy. The evidence was overwhelming, but they both knew cases weren't won on evidence alone. They were won in the courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Helen Carter entered, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Everyone stood. "This court is now in session," Judge Carter said, settling into her chair. "We are here for the preliminary hearing of Dr. Leonard Bishop, charged with fraud, theft, and the illegal distribution of medical supplies. Prosecution, you may begin." Pam stood, walking toward the jury box with calculated confidence. "Your Honor, we will prove that Dr. Bishop systematically diverted hospital supplies for personal financial gain. He used his position to falsify records, misdirect shipments, and profit from illegal medical sales." She turned to the jury. "The evidence is clear. Paper trails, surveillance footage, bank statements, all leading back to the defendant. And yet, Dr. Bishop stands before you today, unwilling to admit the truth." Pam returned to her seat. Judge Carter nodded. "Defense, your opening statement." Kessler stood, buttoning his suit. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. My client is a dedicated doctor, a man who has saved countless lives. There is no proof that he personally benefited from these alleged transactions." Pam glanced at Wilkes. They were about to change that. "Call your first witness," Judge Carter said. Pam stood. "The prosecution calls David Molina." The courtroom doors opened, and a man in his early 40s stepped in. He wore a blue maintenance uniform, a hospital transport driver. As Molina took the stand, Pam approached. "Mr. Molina, do you recognize the defendant?" Molina swallowed. "Yes." "Dr. Bishop. Can you describe your job at the hospital?" "I work in supply transport. I move equipment and medications from the loading dock to storage." Pam nodded. "And did you ever receive special instructions regarding deliveries?" Molina hesitated. Judge Carter spoke. "Answer the question, Mr. Molina." Molina exhaled. "Yes. Dr. Bishop would sometimes have me redirect shipments." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Pam pressed forward. "Redirect them where?" Molina's voice was quiet. "To a warehouse on the east side of town." Kessler stood. "Objection. Speculation." Pam turned. "Your Honor, we have delivery logs signed by the witness." Judge Carter nodded. "Overruled. Continue." Pam pulled a signed invoice from her file. "Is this your signature on the delivery record?" Molina nodded. "Yes." "And is this Dr. Bishop's?" Molina swallowed hard. "Yes." Pam walked back to the prosecution's table. The jury was listening now. She turned. "No further questions." Kessler stood. "Mr. Molina, were you ever explicitly told that these deliveries were illegal?" Molina hesitated. "No." Kessler spread his arms. "Then you were simply following orders." "Thank you." He sat. Judge Carter turned to Pam. "Next witness." Pam nodded. "The prosecution calls Detective Ryan Wilkes." Wilkes took the stand, his badge glinting. Pam approached. "Detective, what did your investigation uncover?" Wilkes pulled out a bank statement. "We found large cash deposits in Dr. Bishop's accounts, totaling over $200,000. These deposits coincide with the stolen shipments." Kessler stood. "Objection. No proof this money came from illegal activity." Pam smirked. "Your Honor, we also have recorded conversations between Dr. Bishop and known medical smugglers." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. "Overruled. The jury will hear it." Pam hit play. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Bishop's voice filled the speakers. "Just move the shipment. I'll take care of the paperwork. Keep my name out of it." Gasps filled the room. Pam turned to the jury. The defendant knew exactly what he was doing. Bishop's hands gripped the table. The pressure was building. Pam Saturday, no further questions. The defense had nothing to say. Judge Carter sighed. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow." As Bishop was led away, Pam knew he was breaking. Pam Bondi sat at the prosecution's table, flipping through her notes. The trial was reaching its breaking point, and she knew it. Dr. Leonard Bishop was running out of options. Across the courtroom, Bishop sat with his attorney, Robert Kessler, looking exhausted. His once confident posture had crumbled under the weight of evidence, witness testimony, and financial records linking him to the illegal medical supply ring. The judge entered. "Court is now in session. Prosecution, you may proceed." Pam stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Dr. Leonard Bishop to the stand." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Bishop hadn't planned to testify. Kessler immediately stood. "Objection. My client is under no obligation to testify." Judge Carter turned to Bishop. "Dr. Bishop, do you wish to testify?" For a moment, Bishop hesitated. Then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded. "Yes." Pam felt the shift in the room. This was it. Bishop took the stand, adjusting the microphone. He looked tired, defeated. Pam approached. "Dr. Bishop, did you authorize shipments of medical supplies to a warehouse not affiliated with St. Augustine Medical Center?" Bishop hesitated, glancing at Kessler, but then nodded. "Yes." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Pam kept her voice steady. "Did you knowingly falsify hospital records to cover up these shipments?" Bishop swallowed hard. "Yes." Kessler ran a hand through his hair, knowing the case was slipping through his fingers. Pam stepped closer. "Who were you working with?" Bishop exhaled. "Daniel Vega. He handled the sales." Pam nodded. "And who were these supplies being sold to?" Bishop hesitated, shame flickering across his face. "Underground medical clinics. Some were in poor communities, treating people who couldn't afford hospitals. Others, I don't know. I didn't ask questions." Pam studied him. "But you took the money." Bishop's gaze fell. "Yes." Kessler sighed, knowing the case was lost. Pam turned to Judge Carter. "Your Honor, given the defendant's full confession, we move to recommend a plea deal in exchange for cooperation in prosecuting others involved." Judge Carter nodded. "Dr. Bishop, are you willing to cooperate?" Bishop's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." Pam glanced at Wilkes. They had won. Judge Carter turned to the jury. "This court is adjourned. The defendant will remain in custody pending sentencing." As the courtroom emptied, Pam exhaled. Another case closed. She turned to Wilkes. "Let's go after the rest of them." The fight wasn't over. But this was a start.